Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Garden Robinson, and I'm your host for today's Field to Fork webinar. This is brought to you by North Dakota State University Extension. This is the 11th year we've done this series, and we're really glad you joined us today. We have archived all the webinars from the previous years, and the link is on our Field to Fork page. You may also download a certificate of attendance. And I'm happy to report we've had about 50,000 live and recorded views since we began this series. And we offer a special welcome to all our watch parties around North Dakota. Welcome to all of you. The next slide shows the upcoming webinars. We hope you join us for these as well. And if you notice, you get to learn about sous vide cooking, so that's probably something new to most of us. Because this program is sponsored in part with grant funding from USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, I will ask all of you to complete the very short online survey that is emailed right after or at the end of today's webinar. And we have been sending out prizes every week. So, as a thank you, we will provide prizes to the lucky winners of the random drawings. But I need to mention that all of you need to put your complete address, including your city, state, and zip code, so that we can reach you if you win. After the summer season, we are going to send a follow-up survey to learn what you did and how you're doing. And I also want to thank Scott Swanson and Ada Erlinson for their technical support, because these don't happen automatically. We do need technical support to make the Field to Fork program work. And now I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Esther McGinnis. Esther is an extension horticulturalist and director of the NDSU Extension Master Gardener program, and she's an associate professor within the Department of Plant Sciences. She and her graduate students research pollinator attraction, plants that can take cyclical saturation and drought, and also native plants. I'm very happy to introduce Esther, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Julie. I'm always happy to be part of Field to Fork. Now, before we begin, I do have to show you our non-discrimination statement. So NDSU does not discriminate against anybody with respect to programming and activities. All right, so today we're going to be talking about debunking garden myths. And there are a ton of garden myths and just general misinformation that are on websites and social media. And these myths are spread by garden influencers, many of which have no horticulture training whatsoever. So one of my hobbies is searching the internet for garden misinformation, and there are just a ton of these so-called garden hacks that consist of using homemade products either to enhance plant growth, to act as like a fertilizer substitute or pesticide substitute. So today we'll take a look at some of the most persistent garden myths that are out there and debunk them using scientific studies. Now, it isn't a surprise that garden myths are so prevalent. People are getting their information from a wide variety of sources. And unfortunately, there are many people, many consumers that are not necessarily discerning in what proper sources are and which ones are the most accurate. Now, fortunately, we do have marketing studies that show us where our home gardeners primarily getting their information. What are their sources? So not surprisingly, over a quarter of them primarily get their information from websites. You'll see that a substantial portion are educated through independent garden centers and big box stores like Home Depot. I'm happy to see that more people are learning about gardening through independent garden centers because you're more likely to encounter somebody with horticulture training at these garden centers as opposed to big box stores. Um, Unsurprisingly, people are getting educated or maybe miseducated on social media, and then only 5% of gardeners are getting their primary source of information from university extension. Now, when we drill down and look at social media sources, these are the big five. Now, unsurprisingly, YouTube's the top of the list. Facebook has been falling in popularity. And then to round out the top five, you've got Instagram, you've got Pinterest, and you've got TikTok. All right, so that last one kind of hurts me. I'm not a big fan of TikTok. So in addition to, some of the garden myths that are persisting due to social media influencers, we now have misinformation that's coming from artificial intelligence. So the younger generations are calling this AI slop. And what happens is that AI, is putting together information that may or may not be accurate, and it's also creating lots of photos that are not accurate. For example, you'll see this blue dahlia. Now, looking at that, it is beautiful, but here's the thing. This is not real. There are no blue dahlias out there. Dahlias don't have the gene to have that robin egg blue color in their petals. You might see kind of a reddish purple, but that's as close to blue as you're going to get. So this is just an example of some misinformation. Now, this is pictorial misinformation, but it's misinformation nonetheless. And then you're seeing these types of photos trying to sell you plants that don't even exist. But I'm not going to blame younger generations for some of the garden myths that are on social media. Every generation has this problem. So a couple decades ago, there were a series of books that were published that had tonics like this, where you would just go to your cupboard, you get a can of Coke or Pepsi, mix it with some ammonia, mouthwash, Epsom salts, and beer, and then spray it using a 20-gallon hose end sprayer on your lawn. Folks, this has been debunked. This is not what you should be doing. There's no lawn out there that's going to benefit from doing this. But what I'm trying to say is that each generation has its source of misinformation. And if you go back to the late 1800s, we had all the ads for snake oil. All right, today I'm going to give you a little outline as to the topics we're going to cover. We're going to be looking at garden hacks that you would apply to the soil. So these would be soil amendments, mulch, so-called fertilizers. So we'll look at them and see which ones have some scientific backing and which don't. We'll look at some remedies, do-it-yourself remedies for pest control, both in terms of insecticide and fungicide. And then we'll end with some really cool myths about nightshade vegetables. All right, to make this a little bit more fun, we're going to use a trivia format. Now, if you printed out the questions before, that's fine. You can kind of keep score. Otherwise, if you have a piece of paper handy, you can certainly keep track of how many points you have in this little trivia contest. I have to tell you, there's no prize for it other than bragging rights, but I'll ask you at the end, how many points did you get? All right, just to practice here, I'm going to ask you the simple question, and think of this as like a bonus point for you all. So, who lives in a pineapple under the sea? Is it Ariel? Is it SpongeBob or Ursula? All right, give yourself a point if you said SpongeBob SquarePants. So that's kind of how it's going to work. But let's first start off with our soil amendments, fertilizers, and mulch. One of the persistent garden myths out there pertains to coffee grounds. So of these, which is the best evidence-based use for your coffee grounds in the garden? And I'm going to tell you there's one answer for this particular question. Is the best evidence-based use as a source of nitrogen, as a soil acidifier, as a weed suppressant, or as a compost ingredient? All right, so go ahead, record your answer. All All right, give yourself 1 point if you said as a compost ingredient. Now I'm going to go through, each one of these claims and explain it to you. Um, Now, if we look at spent coffee grounds, there are lots of individuals that say that it is a source of nitrogen, and that is true, but that's not the full story. If you do a fertilizer analysis, spent coffee grounds are about 1 to 2% nitrogen. But here's the part that gets interesting. If you were to just spread those coffee grounds in your vegetable garden around plants, it's not necessarily going to help. And that's because the nitrogen that is in the coffee grounds is not in a form that is available to the plants. In order to make this form available, the soil microbes have to work on it, convert it into another form. But in that process, it's tying up nitrogen because the microbes also need some nitrogen. Um, so your better option here is instead of just throwing those coffee grounds in your vegetable garden, better to put it in your compost. Let the soil microbes or let the microbes in the compost work on it and break it down. Now, understandably, some of you may have thought that coffee grounds could act as a soil acidifier. But and that's a good guess. But here's what the truth is. So we know coffee is acidic. Like if you drink too much coffee, you're going to know it because you're going to be a little nauseous, your stomach's going to be upset. So I'm not surprised that there are some of you that think that coffee grounds would be really acidic. But most of the acid is consumed when we drink the coffee. There's very little left in the coffee grounds. So with the coffee grounds, the pH is slightly acidic. So I want you to think back to your chemistry class. Think about that 14-point pH scale. So remember, right smack in the middle at 7.0, that's neutral. If you go to a higher number, that's getting more alkaline or basic. If you're going to a lower number, that's more acidic. But here at 6.5 to 6.8, that's just mildly acidic. That's not going to do anything to your soil, and that's not going to change the pH of your soil. And so I would not use this as a soil acidifier. All right, so the third thing we were thinking about, could coffee grounds be a weed suppressant? I'm going to say yes, but here's the problem. The problem is that, yes, it can in fact suppress weed seed germination, but it could also suppress the germination of your desirable vegetable seeds. Coffee grounds are what we call allelopathic. That means there's a compound in them that interferes with germination and with plant growth of other plants. So this is very similar to like black walnut. So with our spent coffee grounds, we don't want to be spreading this around the garden because it could be detrimental to your desirable plants. It could prevent your vegetable seed germination, and we know it's toxic and harmful to plants such as tomato. So the better and most supported use for coffee grounds is letting it percolate in your compost. So up to 20% by volume. So the reason that I say that you need to limit what goes into your compost is, yes, you do need a good balance of green and brown materials, but also you don't want it all to be coffee grounds because of that allelopathic aspect. So limit the amount that goes in there. Then the allelopathic effect is diluted, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. All right, so our number 2 question here. So we're going to be thinking about eggs and eggshells as garden remedies. So which egg or eggshell remedy is supported by scientific evidence? And I'm going to give you a hint that you can pick 2 of these. So is it as a deer or rabbit deterrent? Is there evidence for preventing blossom end rot in tomatoes? What about as a compost ingredient? Or as a slug deterrent? Okay, record your answers and I'll give you the answers. So there is evidence for the use of whole eggs as a deer or rabbit deterrent. And you can also compost your eggshells. The remaining two are myths. So you can't prevent blossom end rot in tomatoes, and eggshells are not an effective slug deterrent. So let's dig into that. I'm showing you the label for liquid fence. So liquid fence is an it's a deer and rabbit repellent. This happens to be the brand that we use in the NDSU campus gardens. Now, I'm not recommending one brand over another, but the point I'm trying to make here is we need to train our rabbits in the spring. So my garden manager plants, 200 to 300 cultivars of annuals each year, and that's a lot of work for her annual trials. So she wants to protect them. She sprays the foliage with deer and rabbit repellent. And as you can see, what is the active ingredient that is in largest percentage? It's putrescent whole egg solids. All right, so don't be turned off by the name putrescent. That really just means putrid or rotten. So there is therefore scientific evidence for using this as a deer and rabbit repellent. They also throw in some garlic and thyme oil and some other ingredients. Now, theoretically, you could make your own critter repellent recipe. This is one that comes to us from the Colorado Extension Master Gardeners. So they suggest mixing with a quart of water, a couple of beaten raw eggs. You can then add in some spicy pepper for good measure, because those rabbits and deer really don't appreciate the spiciness. Add in some garlic, um, and then you blend this all together. Pour it through cheesecloth because you got to have like a liquid that is able to go into a spray bottle and to be able to be sprayed without clogging it. And here's the fun part. You then let it rot in the sun and then go ahead and spray that on your plants. So that is a critter repellent recipe. One caution, I wouldn't use this in an edible garden. You don't want to be spraying this on your lettuce or your spinach because that's not necessarily going to be good for food safety per se. But this works very nicely on ornamental plants. But anyway, so just explaining that there is scientific backing for using putrid eggs as a critter repellent, but just don't use it in your edible garden. So in our trivia question, we identified that eggshells are not good for managing blossom end rot. So I say they're not extraordinary. Um, okay, bad joke there. Um, so so what's behind blossom end rot? Let's dive into the science behind that so we can understand it. It is a very complex issue. I'm going to just kind of handle it on the surface. But blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency in the plant. And at the same time, our region, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, our soils are very calcium rich. So what gives? Oops. The problem is that we've got a water transport problem. So that's why I'm showing you this Roman aqueduct here. So I want you to think about water transport. So if we're in a period of drought, we don't have enough water to dissolve the calcium in the soil, which can then be absorbed by the root system, be taken up in the transpiration stream into the plant, and be distributed to the leaves and to the fruit. So that's why we end up with blossom end rot in our tomatoes. So the best way to manage blossom end rot is not by digging in eggshells into our soil. It's not by putting Tums or Rolaids into the soil. It's thinking about managing the soil moisture. So maintain even soil moisture. You can also mulch your garden to retain the moisture so it doesn't just evaporate. Be careful about fertilizing. If you over fertilize, you're going to produce more leaves. And if you have too many leaves, the leaves are going to outcompete the fruit for that calcium that they need for fruit production. And then be careful when you're hoeing the garden or cultivating. You don't want to injure the root system because that's going to effectively end water transport if you injure those roots. And then be aware that blossom end rot is more likely to happen just as fruit production is starting. So hopefully we've put that myth out of its misery. So don't use eggshells, rolaids, or tums in your soil to manage blossom end rot. That's not going to be effective. You need to focus on water transport. So what about eggshells? Are they an effective slug deterrent? And the answer is a resounding no. So eggshells will not deter slugs. And one of my good friends actually did the research on this. So that was Jeff Gilman. So he's written some great books on debunking garden myths, but he actually went out in the garden, captured some slugs, put them on paper plates in the center of the plate, and then built a ring of eggshells, broken up eggshells around the slugs, and then waited to see if they would cross that line of eggshells. They did. It did not deter them in the least. So eggshells are not an effective slug deterrent. So don't fall for this garden myth. Instead, think about other means of controlling your slugs. First of all, you can think of cultural methods. Slugs really, really love wet conditions. So, reducing the humidity, if you're over irrigating, maybe cutting back, and then cleaning up if there's like some dead debris in your garden, because that provides hiding places for the slugs. Some various ways that you can handle the slugs. You can use diatomaceous earth. So diatomaceous earth will deter them from crossing the line. So this is made up of little marine diatoms. So it's the skeletons of diatoms, and it's made out of silicon. And that's very sharp. So it's like glass, essentially. So, of course, those slugs with those delicate bodies don't want to cross the diatomaceous earth, so that can work. The only problem is that diatomaceous earth does lose its effectiveness when you've got frequent rainfalls. Now, there are other methods of managing slugs. You can use a bait. There are about 3 different chemical formulations. I'm giving you the one called iron phosphate because it's less toxic than the other 2. So iron phosphate is in Sluggo and escargot. Um, Now, the one thing I would say is it's supposed to be a lot safer with pets, but I still try and protect pets. I wouldn't let them try and consume this, but at the same time, this is a whole lot less toxic than previous formulations that had metaldehyde. All right, so one final point regarding eggs and eggshells. Now, we did show in our answer that it is possible to compost eggshells. So it is possible, and this could be okay if you do have a calcium deficiency in your soil, but I'll tell you, it's a lot of work. So what you need to do is you could dry your eggshells, yeah, for a few days, and then you put them in the oven to dry at 200 degrees for 15 minutes. Get them really dry, and then you want to grind them. So if you've got like an old coffee grinder, an old blender, you grind them into a really fine powder. So you can put that powder in your compost, but just realize it's going to take a long, long time for this to fully compost and degrade. But it's not harmful. And then we've got other individuals that are using this grit, this powder from eggshells, for worm composting. So that's one potential use, but I have to tell you that's going to be a little bit of work on your end. All right, so our next trivia question. Which use or uses of Epsom salts is or are not supported by scientific evidence? So notice the not. So which uses are not supported by scientific evidence? And I might give you a hint here that there's more than one here. So the first one is bath ingredient to ease aches and pains. The second is a foot soak for tired feet. And the third is blossom end rot. So what do you think? All right, so of course, this is not a blossom end rot remedy, and we'll go further into that. But I'll tell you, there isn't robust scientific evidence that it eases aches and pains, or as a foot soak for tired feet. So Epsom salts. Now, there's nothing wrong with using Epsom salts. People have been using them, for a long, long time. But the scientific evidence is really marginal as to its effectiveness. And that's because if you've got tired muscles, how would those Epsom salts get to your muscles? You've got skin as a barrier. Um, if you're actually feeling some relief from your Epsom soak bath or foot soak, that's more from the fact that you're relaxing in a hot bath and the fact that you may be enjoying any fragrance that's mixed in with your Epsom salts. Um, so I'm going to tell you that the actual ingredient of Epsom salts is not really doing a whole lot for you, and it's certainly not remedying your achy muscles because how is it going to be able to go through your skin to your muscles? And in fact, you wouldn't want it to. But let's focus on this garden myth. And this is like the worst persistent garden myth. It never seems to die, despite how we horticulturists um, rail against this. So magnesium makes blossom end rot worse. So let's first talk about the chemical compound here. So blossom end rots, or I'm sorry, um, Epsom salts are composed of magnesium sulfate. So as we learned, earlier in this presentation, blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency. So why would adding magnesium to the soil make it better? In fact, it can make it worse. And that's for those of you that are chemistry buffs, if you remember that magnesium and calcium both have the same charge. Their ions have the same charge, which is 2 plus. So if you've got too much magnesium that's been worked into your soil, it can inhibit the plant from taking up calcium, which worsens blossom end rot. And furthermore, magnesium soil deficiencies are extremely rare. We're more likely to see that in heavy commercial production. So think, you've got heavy agronomic crops like corn and whatnot. And it's more likely to happen if you have sandy, acidic soil. So I'm going to tell you folks, before you just willy-nilly add Epsom salts to your garden, test the soil. Most likely your garden is not deficient in magnesium. And if it's not deficient, just leave it alone. All right, so which statement is false regarding the use of pine needles in the garden? So we hear this one a lot. So I'm going to tell you there's one statement here. Whoops. There's one statement here that is false. So can you use pine needles as a natural soil acidifier? Do they suppress weed growth? And do they help the soil retain moisture? So which one of these statements is false? All right, so I'll give you the answer here, and there's one answer. The false one is pine needles do not naturally acidify your soil. So pine needles start off, in fact, a little on the acidic side, but here's the thing. When they drop from the tree, land on the soil and then start to decompose, the soil microbes decompose the pine needles, and in that process, they become neutral. So they don't change the soil pH. And one of my good friends did the research on this. David Zlezak, he's now with the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. So he showed that there's no way that pine needles are going to change the soil pH here. So the soil has this tremendous ability to resist change. And folks, if we had a good remedy to acidify the soil, all of us horticulturists and soil scientists would be telling you about it. So I just want to show you this map. You'll notice that here in the central part of the country, in the Central Plains, here down all the way to Texas, we've got very alkaline soil. So I wish there were good ways to remedy the soils. Now the East Coast has more acidic soils, so it's a little bit easier for them. Um, Now just showing you a close-up of our tri-region here. Here, let me get my little pointer here. So where I live here in Fargo, our soils are on average 7.9 to 8.0. If I could acidify the soil and make it easier to grow blueberries, I would, but using pine needles is not going to help, and you can't add enough other elements like sulfur to make it work. So instead, we just kind of work with it, and we don't grow vegetables or fruits that require acidic soils. However, I'll tell you, don't waste those pine needles. Those pine needles are a fabulous mulch. So hopefully you gave yourself, hopefully you recognize that pine needles suppress the weeds like any mulch, and they also help retain soil moisture. On top of that, those needles kind of knit together so they don't blow away, and then they're kind of slow to break down so they don't have to be replaced. So pine needles are a fabulous mulch. So if you have a free source of pine needles, go ahead and use them, but don't think they're going to change the soil pH. All right, so we've talked about kind of the soil amendments. We'll talk about a couple home remedies as insecticide and fungicide substitutes here. So which statements are true here? And there's more than one statement true. So the first statement is insecticidal soap can kill soft-bodied insects like aphids. Dish soaps are not real soap. And do-it-yourself insecticidal soap made with dish soap may be harmful to plants. All right, so make your selections. All right, so here are the answers. It's all three statements are true. So if you checked all three, give yourself 3 points. So let's talk about insecticidal soap in general and how they work. Insecticidal soap is used to kill soft-bodied insects, so think like aphids, um, white flies, etc. How it works is that the soap will dissolve the coating on these soft-bodied insects. They've got a coating that's called a waxy cuticle. So this insecticidal soap will dissolve the wax, and that poor insect will dry up and die. Another potential mode of action is it can block the breathing pores. There are lots of do-it-yourself insecticidal soap recipes that are on the internet, and they've got differing ratios of, differing numbers of tablespoons of dish soap to water. But here's what we need to understand. Dish soap, very, very effective at cleaning dishes. So it removes the wax, the oil, and the grease. So yes, dish soap could potentially remove the waxy cuticle on the insects. But here's something else to think about. If we're using a homemade dish soap, insecticidal soap, we could be harming the plant. That's because the leaves here in this leaf cross section, the leaf has a waxy cuticle here. So we could be dissolving that protective coating that's on the leaf, and the leaves may end up being burnt up if we are doing do-it-yourself insecticidal soaps. So this may blow some of your minds, but dish soap is really not a true soap. It's actually a synthetic detergent, and there are lots of different components. I didn't put together the whole list of ingredients because that would fill an entire slide, but these are broad categories of ingredients in common dish soaps or dish detergents. So there are cleaning agents and surfactants, solvents, salt, perfumes, colorant, opacifiers, preservatives, water softeners, and antibacterial agents. And these all help the dish soap be more effective at removing stains and removing food particles from your dishes and your pans. So perfectly formulated for that. But here's the thing. Do you want this on your plant? It could very well be harmful because the dish detergent companies are not making this as an insecticide for you. So this could certainly be harmful to your plant. And then furthermore, there's so many dish detergents out there and they differ in formulations. And even one brand could have multiple formulations. So I would say give up on the do-it-yourself insecticidal soap. So true soaps are really, really rare. And I would bet there are very few of you on this webinar today that actually have true soap in your house. So true soap is made the old-fashioned way where there's a chemical reaction between a fat or an oil and lye. So the lye could be made out of sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, and they'll become relevant here in a minute. But in the old days, they made soaps out of lye and animal fat because that's what they had available. Now, today, they make true soaps out of vegetable oil and alkali salts. So I actually have a ball of true soap in my house right now. My daughter gave us this for Christmas. So she brings home some unusual gifts for us. So this happens to be a true soap that's made out of olive oil and an alkali salt. Now it's very different. It's not sudsing like I'm used to. But I'll tell you, most of you out there, you don't have a true soap in your house. All of your bar soaps, your liquid soaps, they're actually synthetic detergents. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for you, but it's not a true soap. But here's my point. Instead of making a homemade insecticidal soap, it's better to buy a commercial insecticidal soap, and that's because it is a true soap. It is made out of that potassium salts of fatty acids. So it's a true soap, and it's specially formulated not to be harsh on plants. It's not going to burn off the wax on the plants. And it still has action against aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, and other soft-bodied insects. In order for commercial or any insecticidal soap to be effective, you must make contact with the insect pest. It's not a deterrent or a repellent. It only works if it makes contact and coats the insect pest and burns away that waxy cuticle. All right, so we're going to get to tobacco. So lots of myths and legends online about tobacco. So which statement or statements are true here? So here we've got A. You can soak chewing tobacco in water to create a safe insecticide. B. Tobacco leaves can harbor plant viruses. C. Greenhouses discourage workers from smoking in the greenhouse. All right, so think about it, and then I'll show you which statements are true. And there are two of them here. So what's true is that tobacco leaves can harbor plant viruses, and greenhouses discourage workers from smoking in the greenhouse or chewing tobacco or having contact with plants. So you cannot create a safe chewing tobacco solution to use as an insecticide. And I'll show you why. All right, so here I've got a photo here of a can of chewing tobacco. Yes, I did go out and buy it, and I have to admit I was very embarrassed to buy this, but I got a prop. I was able to take a photo of it. All right, so here's what's in tobacco. You all know it's nicotine. And nicotine is a stimulant. So all smokers know that nicotine is a stimulant and they depend and are addicted to that stimulant. So you can imagine this could be effective at killing insects because, if you apply nicotine to an insect, it's going to overstimulate the nerve system of the insect. But the problem is that using nicotine-based insecticides are not safe. They're not safe for a number of reasons. It's not safe for humans. So while we do have individuals that are inhaling nicotine and such, some of these homemade recipes could be harmful to humans and could actually pass through the skin. So we don't like to be handling tobacco-based insecticides, but we also have a problem with plant viruses. So plant viruses can persist in cigarettes and chewing tobacco. This is tobacco mosaic virus. And I believe this was the very first plant virus that was ever discovered. It is fatal to plants and affects hundreds of different species of plants. So we don't want to be making uh, homemade homemade tobacco-based insecticides because we can kill our plants and give them a disease here. But furthermore, what you need to realize is that these tobacco mosaic virus particles can be so persistent that we don't want them in the greenhouse either, because workers can then transfer those virus particles to plants and infect them. So we try and stay away from these tobacco-based products. So not a good, safe insecticide for plants when you're making them from chewing tobacco as a homemade recipe. All right, here's our fungicide question. And our fungicide question is, okay, so which statement is true about cinnamon in the garden? So lots of garden influencers talking about cinnamon, but which statement or statements are true? There's only one species of cinnamon. Cinnamon powder has been proven to prevent or cure damping off, which is caused by fungi. Or C, cinnamon should be further studied before it's recommended for garden use. So what do you think? All right, the answer is C, cinnamon should be further studied before it's recommended for garden use. There is some initial evidence to show that a particular compound in cinnamon called cinnamaldehyde may have some antifungal or antimicrobial properties, but it's still in its infancy. And here's another problem. There's so many different species of cinnamon, and they do vary in their chemical compositions. So I'm showing you 4 here that we commonly consume, but there's definitely more than 4 species of cinnamon that can be consumed. There's true cinnamon, which is Ceylon or which is from Sri Lanka. So this is called Cinnamomum verum. This has a very delicate flavor, and that's what most Europeans and Mexicans use. And then there are what we call our fake cinnamons or cassia cinnamons. And the Chinese cassia cinnamon is what they use in Chinese 5-spice. So we don't use this as much. You may see it if you are using Chinese 5-spice in Asian cooking. Now, we in the US are more likely to see Vietnamese or cinnamon. Vietnamese or currant J cinnamon. So Vietnamese or Saigon cinnamon is really sweet and spicy, and that's one species I really liked. And then currant J is probably the most common ground cinnamon that's sold in the U.S. But there are very different properties, different flavors in them, and I know that Vietnamese cinnamon can have high levels of coumarin. Which is being kind of debated in Europe as to what's a safe level of coumarin for human consumption. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when people say they're using cinnamon in the garden, what species are they using? I mean, they have all different actions. And if you look at some of the scientific studies that tried to use cinnamon in the garden, they didn't even identify the species of cinnamon. So what did they actually use? There are different forms of cinnamon that have been used in studies. Essential oils and alcohol extracted cinnamon compounds tend to be stronger, but there's also powder and water extraction. But I'll tell you, as far as I know, I have not found a study showing that sprinkling cinnamon powder on the soil is going to prevent or cure damping off fungicide among your seedlings. So this is a garden myth I'm debunking. So save your expensive cinnamon for baking. All right, so just a couple more questions here before we wrap up and take questions. We'll talk about nightshade family myths. And this one pertains to bell peppers. If you read my newspaper column, you probably already have the answer to these questions. So my newspaper column this week is about bell peppers. So which statement is true? Female bell peppers have 4 or 5 lobes or bumps on the bottom of the fruit. Male bell peppers have 3 lobes or bumps. Female bell peppers are sweeter than male, or none of the above. What do you think? So the answer is none of the above. So the myth that is being perpetuated by garden influencers is that female peppers have 4 or 5 lobes on the bottom and males have 3 lobes. The myth goes on to say that the female peppers are sweeter and better used for fresh eating versus male peppers, which should be used for cooking. Folks, I'm going to tell you, when this came out, we horticulturists laughed ourselves silly. That's because the garden influencers, they don't know their birds and their bees. I mean, it's just ridiculous. All right, so here we're going to get into a little reproductive biology. It's not going to be enough to make you blush. Don't worry. So bell peppers are what we call perfect flowers. So what happens is that you've got male components. Here, let's see if okay. You've got male components such as the stamens. So the stamens are in blue and they release pollen grains. In the middle, you'll see there's that green knob, and hopefully you can see my pointer here. The stigma in the middle is the female component. In the bell pepper, since it's considered a perfect flower, it self-pollinates in that the pollen grains are deposited on the stigma. The pollen grains germinate, they grow down the stigma and into the style, and then at the bottom of the stigma is the ovary. And there are ovules there. The pollen grains fertilize those ovules, and that's how you get seeds. And the process by which it does this, it forms a fruit. So by definition, all fruits are from flower ovary tissue. So there's not male and female. It's all over. All these fruits are, by definition, a swollen ovary that contains the seeds. And the seeds are produced by a union of male and female gametes. So the number of lobes or chambers within that pepper has nothing to do with gender. So don't fall for that. And also, furthermore, the number of lobes doesn't influence sweetness. If you want to have a sweeter pepper, you focus on stage of ripeness. Here's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, and that is peppers can change colors. So all bell peppers start off as green. And then depending on the cultivar, they'll either turn red, orange, yellow, and I think there are even some purple bell peppers out there. So the color that's not green is the stage that's riper. So the riper the pepper, the sweeter it's going to be. So the green pepper, which is the immature stage, that's always going to be the least sweet. And then out of the different colors of peppers, red is the sweetest, and then yellow and orange are going to be in the middle. All right, so we'll move on. One more question here. So which statement is true? Purple potatoes are GMOs. Wait a second here. Oh, I may have given away the answer here. Purple potatoes are GMOs. Seed potatoes should be planted on Good Friday, or McDonald's makes French fries from NDSU potatoes. I didn't get my animation working properly, and I gave away the answer here. So the answer is C. And I'll quickly go through my slides here so we can have time for a few questions here before we end up the hour. So purple potatoes are not GMOs. Purple is a very natural color for potatoes, and I believe Julie Garden Robinson would tell you they're very nutritious. So what I've learned from Julie and other nutritionists is that the more colorful, the more nutrients in something. So I just want to dispel the myth that purple potatoes are not genetically modified organisms. Here's another myth that's out there. That's the Good Friday planting tradition for potatoes. there are a couple different stories regarding why potatoes were said to have been planted on Good Friday. One is for religious reasons. So apparently, potato is not listed as a plant in the Bible. So people were suspicious of potatoes when they were initially first being grown in Ireland and other countries. So they were concerned about it and the fact that it was related to nightshade, the weed. So in order to save it, they apparently were planting it on Good Friday and then sprinkling it with holy water. So that's one story that's out there. The other story that's out there is people planted potatoes in Ireland and in Europe on Good Friday because they had the day off. So those are a couple of the stories that are out there. But what I want you to understand is if we plant on Good Friday, we're going to have varying results here. And that's because Easter gets bumped around. So there is a specific formula for when Easter lands. So Easter is the first Sunday after the first spring full moon. So if the spring full moon falls right on Spring Day, which is March 21st, um, you know, the earliest that this could happen would be March 22nd, or it could be as late as April 25th. So this is a difference of like 34, 35 days or so. So not good to use Good Friday as your date for planting. Instead, you want to plant potatoes 2 weeks before the average last spring freeze date and make sure that soil temperatures are 45 degrees or higher. And then back to our correct answer, NDSU potatoes are being used in McDonald's French fries. And that's thanks to Dr. Susie Thompson, which I believe she will be speaking in a couple weeks. She developed a cultivar potato that is good for making French fries. It's called the Dakota Russet, and it's low in sugar, so it's less likely to burn when they are frying up the potatoes. All right, so wrapping up here, if you got all the answers right, you got a total of 16 trivia points. So I'd love to hear, and Julie will be able to look at the chat for me and tell me, how you did on this quiz. But in conclusion, let's be discerning consumers of garden information. Ask yourself, is the information source objective? Or are people trying to sell you something, or are they just trying to get more clicks so they can get paid? Is the information that you use, is it based on scientific studies? And one final point here is you can rely on NDSU Extension for objective science-based information. All right, thank you. And then I will stop sharing here so we can go straight into the questions.
Sure. They really enjoyed your talk. You are now the Mythbuster, and you blew their minds. So there you go. I want to thank you for writing about male and female pepper myths, because I even was at a chef training. I'm not a chef, but I was listening to a chef, and he perpetuated that myth the entire talk. And I had to bite my tongue. Okay, our actual questions. Is the coffee filter itself compostable? Talked about coffee.
Okay, I guess I haven't looked into it, but since most filters that I know of are of paper, it seems like it would be compostable. So I know that there are some people that do it, and I've known of people that use just plain paper, newspapers and stuff, but that's more in worm composting. But yes, I think you can use the filters.
I have a tomato question. Since tomato leaves can take calcium from the fruit and worsen blossom end rot, is it helpful to trim off some leaves once the plant starts producing?
No, it's better to train it from the very beginning as opposed to removing leaves later on. But instead of removing it, what's better is if you focus on growing it right from the very beginning. But there's also the fact that calcium cannot be distributed from leaves to the fruit. So once it's in the leaves, it cannot travel through the plant to the fruit. So cutting off the leaves, that's not going to do anything per se. Um, Instead, it's about, training your plant properly. And I'm sure that there have been talks in the past in Field to Fork where we talked about tomato training and pruning. I'm not going to go too deep into that because I don't have a graphic here, but I'd say instead you should be focusing on water because we want the water to be pulled through the plant and then it will take the calcium to both the leaves and to the fruit. Just don't over fertilize. If you don't over fertilize, you won't have too many leaves.
Now we have a comment about slugs. One of our participants said wool will deter slugs. Have you ever studied wool pellets?
I have a good friend at South Dakota State Extension that is studying wool pellets, and I have a bag of wool pellets back here. I haven't studied them, but there seem to be some good benefits to using them. They could also be a source of nitrogen. They could be so they're being studied, but we don't have a whole lot of research that's been published yet. But it's coming. It's coming.
Another question. What would be the best way to lower the pH of your soil?
Okay, to lower the pH of your soil, you could certainly use elemental sulfur. And it is possible. It does take about a year, and you're going to be using large quantities. So we do have this listed in one of our lawn publications. So I think we've got one on oh, understanding soil testing for lawns. And we've got a table in there that talks about how much sulfur you should use to lower the pH, to precisely lower the pH of your soil. But I'm going to tell you, you can try, but you're not going to go from 8.0 down to 5. I mean, if you do have an alkaline soil, you're not going to be successful at growing blueberries. And that's just something we live with.
And I'll just add that our soil science extension specialist will be one of the last speakers in this series, so you won't want to miss Carlos. More questions about insects. What does dish soap do to lady beetles?
It won't be as harmful to lady beetles because beetles have a shell on them. So dish soap would be a whole lot more harsh on a soft-bodied insect. So we only use them for soft-bodied insects like aphids. But nonetheless, we like our lady beetles. They are good predators of our aphids. So don't try and spray your lady beetles. Ladybugs are voracious predators and they will eat your aphids.
And I'll add that our insect specialist, Jan Knodel, entomologist, will be a speaker coming up as well. So very good. Does cinnamon work to either promote rooting or to reduce rotting when trying to root cuttings?
That needs to be studied. So it seems to have a little bit of effect, but I wouldn't use it to root cuttings yet. I would use something that has already been studied. So you can use IBA, which is the rooting hormone, indole acid. That is a better way to root a propagule than using cinnamon. Now, I'm not saying that we totally understand cinnamon yet. We need to study it more, and we need more funding for consumer horticulture research. There's very little funding to study consumer horticulture, and that's unfortunate.
One last question, since the bells are ringing on the campus at NDSU, so it's 3 o'clock here. Question about composting eggs. How do you prepare those to go in your garden? Do you put those in the oven or dry them out, or what do you do with them?
Okay, so composting of your eggs. I did kind of have a little blurb there where we talked about you could air dry them for a few days, then you put them in the oven for 15 minutes at 200 degrees, dry them up, and then pulverize them in a grinder. It could be like an old coffee grinder or a blender, and then you could put it in the compost. But I'll have you know, it's not going to break down in a year. It's going to take more time than that. But it is one way to compost things as opposed to putting it in the garbage. So I totally understand people wanting to compost them.
Well, I will draw us to a close. Thank you
Mhm.
for a really interesting seminar today. And I just want to invite all of our guests today who are part of our webinar series. Please check out all the resources that we have on the NDSU Extension website, horticulture and beyond. And also don't forget that each one of you is in a state with cooperative extension. So check out the resources that are available to all of us from all over the United States. So I hope you join us next time to hear about sous vide cooking and for the rest of the series. So thanks everyone for being here, and a special thanks to Esther for a very engaging webinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much.